It started as a wave of hope. In late 2010, across North Africa and the Middle East, people took to the streets demanding change. The world watched with fascination as Tunisia, Egypt, Libya, Syria, and other countries erupted in protest. Social media buzzed with images of crowds, slogans, and brave citizens confronting regimes that had ruled for decades. Most observers saw it simply as a people's revolution. Ordinary citizens rising against corruption, oppression, and poverty. But as the protests spread, the story became far more complicated. Was it purely organic? Or were there hidden forces shaping the narrative and the outcomes in ways most of us never realized? On the surface, the causes of the Arab Spring seem obvious. Decades of autocratic rule had left populations frustrated and desperate. Unemployment, rising food prices, and corruption created a tinderbox. The self-immolation of Mohamed Bouazizi in Tunisia became a symbol of personal desperation and systemic failure. Media framed it as the spark that ignited a revolution, and soon Tunisia's president fled. Egypt followed, as millions demanded President Hosni Mubarak's resignation. Libya descended into civil war, Syria into an extended conflict. The narrative was simple, almost poetic. The people demanded justice, and oppressive regimes crumbled. But the deeper you look, the more complex the picture becomes. For example, international reactions were far from uniform. In Tunisia and Egypt, Western media praised the uprisings as triumphs of democracy. Yet in Libya and Syria, the narrative quickly shifted toward instability, sectarianism, and terrorism. U.S. and European involvement was far from passive. Declassified documents, leaked diplomatic cables, and investigative reporting suggest that foreign intelligence agencies had been monitoring these regions closely for years. Some analysts argue that social media platforms, while revolutionary tools, were also leveraged by foreign actors to guide public sentiment and highlight particular grievances over others. Consider Tunisia. While the immediate trigger was Bouazizi's tragedy, the unrest had been brewing in marginalized towns for years. International organizations had documented growing economic inequality, youth unemployment, and lack of political freedoms. Simultaneously, Western governments had invested in digital infrastructure, NGOs, and civil society programs designed to support activism and monitoring. While these programs were often framed as humanitarian or democratic support, critics argue they also created channels that could influence political outcomes. Egypt offers a more striking example. Millions protested in Cairo's Tahrir Square, demanding Mubarak step down. Yet, behind the scenes, the U.S. had long-standing relationships with Egyptian security forces and the ruling elite. Declassified cables indicate that American diplomats were acutely aware of public unrest before it exploded. Some scholars suggest that Washington had a dual strategy: publicly support democratic aspirations to maintain soft power, while quietly ensuring that post-Mubarak governance would remain aligned with Western strategic interests, particularly concerning the Suez Canal, regional stability, and counter-terrorism operations. Libya, by contrast, demonstrates how international strategy and local rebellion can intertwine with deadly consequences. Muammar Gaddafi's regime faced widespread protests in 2011, but the situation escalated rapidly into a full-scale civil war. NATO intervened with airstrikes, officially to protect civilians. However, leaked documents and investigative reports from outlets like The Intercept and The Guardian suggest that strategic objectives, control of Libya's oil resources, weakening a long-standing adversary, and reshaping regional power balances, were influential in the decision to intervene. This illustrates a critical point. While local populations protested for legitimate grievances, global powers often had their own agendas, which shaped the trajectory of these uprisings. Syria complicates the picture even further. Protests in 2011 began peacefully in cities like Daraa, but soon escalated into civil war. Analysts point to a combination of internal repression, sectarian tension, and foreign involvement as factors. The Assad regime, aware of both internal dissent and international scrutiny, employed brutal tactics to maintain control. Meanwhile, multiple external actors, the U.S., Russia, Saudi Arabia, Iran, and Turkey became involved, each pursuing different strategic objectives. What started as localized demands for reform transformed into a protracted proxy conflict, illustrating how regional power struggles can absorb and distort popular movements. Social media is another lens to examine this complexity. Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube played undeniable roles in organizing protests, sharing images of repression and galvanizing international attention. Yet, researchers in digital politics and security studies have highlighted how these platforms can also be exploited. Bots, targeted campaigns, and selective amplification of certain voices can influence narratives and perceptions. In other words, while the uprisings were real, the way the world saw them, and the outcomes that followed, were shaped by both local activism and broader geopolitical strategies. Economic factors cannot be ignored either. Rising global food prices in 2007-2008 had already strained the livelihoods of millions across North Africa and the Middle East. World Bank reports from the period highlight how economic instability, combined with authoritarian governance, created structural weaknesses. Some international observers argue that foreign powers, aware of these vulnerabilities, anticipated the potential for unrest. The combination of domestic grievances and external awareness set the stage for uprisings to gain rapid momentum once a spark, like Bouazizi self-immolation, occurred. In Tunisia, Egypt, Libya, and Syria, the outcomes were strikingly different. Tunisia transitioned toward a fragile but functioning democracy. Egypt experienced a brief period of civilian rule before a military-backed government consolidated power. Libya descended into chaos and fragmentation. Syria became a theater of prolonged war and humanitarian disaster. These divergent outcomes raise an important question. If the revolutions were purely organic, why did some nations stabilize while others collapsed? The evidence points toward a mixture of internal dynamics and external influence shaping the ultimate trajectory. Another layer to consider is the role of ideology and rhetoric. Western media and governments frequently frame the Arab Spring as a struggle between liberty and tyranny, democracy and autocracy. This framing resonated globally, but it also served to simplify complex realities. Many uprisings were not driven solely by ideological visions of democracy, but by immediate needs: jobs, dignity, and security. Yet portraying them as part of a broader democratic wave helped justify international intervention, influence public opinion, and guide policy decisions, often benefiting external powers. Finally, the legal and political frameworks of each country influenced the outcomes. In Tunisia, the presence of active civil society groups and a relatively cohesive state allowed for negotiated political transition. In Libya and Syria, fragmented societies, tribal divisions, and authoritarian legacies made post-uprising stability far more difficult. External interventions amplified these differences, demonstrating that while revolutions may begin from local grievances, the global context profoundly shapes the result. As we move into the second phase of the Arab Spring story, the outcomes of these uprisings reveal the complex interplay between local action and global strategy. In Tunisia, the revolution achieved its most celebrated success: the ousting of President Zine El Abidine Ben Ali and the creation of a fledgling democracy. Civil society groups, trade unions, and moderate political parties played essential roles in negotiating this transition. Yet even here, international actors had quietly influenced the process. Foreign aid, diplomatic engagement, and training programs in governance and electoral management helped guide the trajectory, demonstrating that while Tunisians led the protests, global networks were actively shaping the post-revolutionary environment. Egypt, by contrast, illustrates how external interests can coexist with popular movements to produce mixed results. The fall of Hosni Mubarak in 2011 was hailed as a triumph of people power. Millions of Egyptians celebrated in Tahrir Square, demanding change. Yet within a few years, the military reasserted control, installing Abdel Fattah el-Sisi as president. Reports and analyses suggest that foreign powers, including the United States and Gulf countries, were concerned about instability and the rise of the Muslim Brotherhood. Economic incentives, military support, and diplomatic messaging all played roles in facilitating the return of a strong centralized authority. Here we see a pattern. Grassroots movements collide with geopolitical imperatives, producing outcomes that are only partially determined by the citizens' demands. Libya's fate underscores the devastating consequences when international strategy dominates local realities. NATO intervention, framed as a humanitarian mission, tipped the balance against Muammar Gaddafi. While Libyans sought freedom from authoritarian rule, the intervention lacked a clear plan for post-conflict stabilization. The result was a power vacuum, the rise of militias, an ongoing conflict that persists today. Scholars such as Noam Chomsky and investigative journalists have argued that the strategic interests in Libya, particularly oil and regional influence, were inseparable from the humanitarian narrative presented to the public. Once again, popular movements became entangled in broader geopolitical games. Syria's ongoing conflict offers perhaps the clearest example of the complex layering of internal rebellion and global strategy. Initial protests, sparked by the arrest and torture of teenagers in Dera, reflected genuine grievances against the Assad regime, repression, corruption, and economic hardship. But as protests escalated, foreign actors became deeply involved. The United States, Russia, Iran, Turkey, and Gulf states all pursued conflicting objectives. Some provided support to opposition groups, others to the government. Proxy warfare transformed a domestic movement into an international crisis. Analysts estimate that millions of civilians were displaced, hundreds of thousands killed, and entire cities destroyed. The Syrian case demonstrates that revolutions cannot be understood in isolation. The global context often determines whether uprisings succeed, fail, or descend into catastrophe. There is also strong evidence that digital tools, while empowering activists, became instruments of influence for external players. The proliferation of social media campaigns, selective amplification of voices, and targeted dissemination of information contributed to shaping narratives. In some cases, governments or foreign entities used these platforms to encourage unrest, amplify grievances, or guide public perception. While these tools were not the cause of the uprisings, they were a force multiplier, showing how technology can accelerate movements while simultaneously exposing them to manipulation. Economic factors continued to shape the trajectory of post-uprising societies. Rising unemployment, inflation, and inequality were key grievances that fueled protests in the first place. But in countries like Egypt and Tunisia, international financial institutions, the IMF, World Bank, and bilateral donors imposed structural reforms and financial aid packages that influenced domestic policy. These interventions sometimes stabilized fragile economies, but also constrained the autonomy of newly empowered governments, demonstrating how external actors can shape post-revolution outcomes in ways that serve strategic and economic interests. One cannot ignore the ideological dimension either. The Arab Spring was often framed in Western media as a triumph of liberal democracy and human rights. This framing helped justify diplomatic and military engagement. But on the ground, citizens' priorities were often more pragmatic: jobs, dignity, and an end to corruption. Foreign governments, aware of this divergence between narrative and reality, frequently used the democracy framing to advance strategic objectives, whether through support for particular political factions or military interventions. In other words, ideology and strategy were intertwined, and the popular movement became part of a larger geopolitical story. Looking at long-term outcomes, the Arab Spring demonstrates that while local populations can ignite change, structural and international factors often dictate the durability and direction of that change. Tunisia achieved partial success, Egypt experienced a partial rollback. Libya descended into chaos, and Syria remains mired in conflict. Yemen, Bahrain, and other affected nations also illustrate how uprisings can be contained or redirected based on strategic interests, alliances, and regional power dynamics. The pattern is clear: revolutions are rarely isolated phenomena. They exist within a web of historical, economic, and geopolitical forces. There are also lessons to be drawn about misperception and expectation. International audiences often assume that removing long-standing dictators would automatically produce democracy and stability. This assumption underestimated the depth of institutional weakness, societal divisions, and the influence of external actors. When uprisings encountered entrenched power structures, both domestic and international, the ideal of people-led revolution collided with reality. Some observers have argued that in many cases, foreign intervention unintentionally prolonged conflicts or intensified divisions, raising the question of whether these movements were ever fully autonomous. Historical context also matters. The Arab world has long been shaped by colonial legacies, Cold War dynamics, and regional power struggles. Post-World War II borders, economic policies, and international alliances created structural conditions that made authoritarianism resilient. Popular uprisings, while legitimate expressions of citizen frustration, had to navigate these inherited constraints. External actors, whether pursuing stability, influence, or resources, inevitably interacted with these movements, shaping their trajectories in ways that were often invisible to the broader public. So, what can we conclude about the Arab Spring? It was undeniably real, people risked their lives demanding change, and grievances were genuine. Yet it also interacted with strategic calculations of powerful external actors, regional rivalries, and the manipulation of perception through media and digital tools. In many ways, the popular movements provided both an opportunity and a justification for interventions that served broader geopolitical interests. The result is a complex story where the line between genuine revolution and strategic manipulation becomes blurred. In the end, the Arab Spring forces us to reconsider how we interpret modern revolutions. It challenges the simple narrative of people versus tyrant and asks us to examine the layered realities behind the headlines. It demonstrates that while citizens can ignite transformative movements, the outcome is shaped by a confluence of domestic, regional, and global factors. This does not diminish the courage of the protesters. Rather, it underscores the importance of understanding history in its full complexity. History rarely offers simple answers. The Arab Spring is no exception. It was a movement of real people with real grievances. But it was also a stage upon which global strategies, technological tools, and long-standing structural conditions played out. By examining both the known and the hidden, we gain a fuller understanding of why the uprisings succeeded in some places, failed in others, and why the consequences continue to shape the region to this day. The story of the Arab Spring is far from over. Its lessons about power, perception, and the interplay between local and global forces are not only relevant for the Middle East, but for understanding revolutions anywhere in the world. By exploring both the visible and hidden aspects, we uncover the intricate dance between people's aspirations and the strategic currents that shape history, a dance that continues to influence politics, policy, and international relations today.